In this video, I will be making my first epoxy table. I'm gonna make some really dumb decisions, suffer the consequences, fix my mistakes, and come up with an innovative way to pour epoxy, and eventually end up with an awesome table. I'm your host for Hefesto Design. Let's get started. I bought this huge sycamore slab about a year ago, and it's been sitting in my garage ever since. It's quite a big piece. It's about 150 across and about 9 centimeters in thickness. This huge tree was cut about 6 years ago and it has dried up really nicely, but it still weighs about 60 kilograms. Which is quite ridiculous since I also weigh 60 kilograms, so just to move this slab around I need to use all my strength. As you can see, the surface of the wood is pretty uneven and it has also developed a bit of a bend, so I need to flatten it first. And for this I'm going to be using my router jig that I showed you how I built in my previous videos. It really isn't the best setup because my router can only go so deep and my router sled is quite thick, so I can only remove about half a centimeter at a time. And since the router bit is only touching a half a centimeter, it gets worn out really fast. And this results in those black spots that you can see, those burn marks. But I can just sand them off in the sanding process. After 3 or I think 4 passes, I got this slab pretty much flat. I've already spent a good chunk of time on this, but there's still a bit more to go. There's still a low spot, so I'm gonna move to a smaller router bit and do some finish routing. After that, hopefully the whole slab will be completely flat. Before trying to flatten the entire workpiece, I need to know if I'm flattening it deep enough, because if it's not deep enough, then what's the point? So as you can see, I still need to go a bit deeper with my router bit. After lowering the router bit about a quarter of a centimeter, I think that I got everything and there were just some minor scratches left, which I can remove in the sanding process. There's still a bunch of burn marks and these need to be sanded off. And I didn't know at the time, but this was going to be a huge pain. The first upgrade that I'm going to be implementing in my new shop is a dust collection system, because currently I am the dust collection system and this is really not a good choice long term. But here you go, the slab is flattened. Burn marks aside, I think that I did a good job. Now the next step is going to be cleaning up all the rotted wood and all the bark from the slab. Where I live, it's common to see these sycamore trees lined in parks and in forests, and they grow absolutely humongous. And I do not know the history behind the tree that I'm cutting up right now, but it must have been a very, very old tree. My supplier was just some random dude off Facebook Marketplace, and I had to go down to a tiny village about 3 hours of a drive away, and I bought actually 4 slabs, I think, from this sycamore tree. 3 of them are cookies like this one is the nicest, and one of them is just a huge lengthwise cut slab, which I'm going to be making a river table out of. And I know that river tables are quite controversial, but thankfully that really doesn't concern me because I just don't care. Anyways, I'm going to be very minimal with epoxy on this project. So after finishing up with this nylon wheel on the sides of the whole slab, I move on to the top surface. And there's not that much to be done here. There are a couple of spots where some branches grew and some rotted wood appeared, but it's quite easy to just take it out with a screwdriver. Basically, all I'm doing is feeling for softwood or anything that's loose, out of place, and just removing it. The only epoxy that I'm going to be using is to fill these tiny gaps, and I decided on using some black epoxy. I think that it would look really contrasting and quite nice with this color of wood. But before I can cross that bridge, I need to tell you about fear. I'm really frightened by this project, because this is the first time that I'm going to be working with epoxy, and it's a really nasty substance. It smells bad, it causes cancer, you can't get it on your skin, you need good ventilation for it, and it can also stain the wood, crack the wood, and all sorts of other nasty, huge mistakes can happen when you're working with epoxy. So this is going to be really, really interesting and really, really frightening. Oh, and I didn't even mention, it costs a lot of money. I'm basically broke, but I spent my last dimes on like 3 gallons of epoxy, and I'm hoping to God that it will be enough. But I guess time will tell. Hopefully not that many mistakes will happen. But let's get the commentary back on track. So, after removing all the large chunks of wood that were sticking out of each crack, I went in with a wire wheel attachment on my Dremel. This just kind of crisped up all the edges of the cracks, and I think that it makes a huge difference in the final appearance of the slab. This was a bit tedious. It took about 4 or 5 hours to finish every single crack, and I got pretty bored by the end, but thankfully I bought these Bluetooth headphones that fit under my hearing protection, and I could listen to some music while I was doing it, so that made all the difference. After the cleanup, it was time to clean up, because I sprayed wood dust everywhere, and you just can't pour epoxy in a dusty shop, so I had to clean up every single surface that was going to be touched by epoxy. After watching hours upon hours of YouTube videos about epoxy tables, I realized that you cannot pour deep black epoxy onto raw, untreated wood. First, you gotta seal it. And for that, I'm going to be using some clear epoxy. So I'm just gonna slather the whole workpiece in this clear epoxy, and hopefully it will soak it all up, and it will prevent any staining that might happen from the black stuff. I'm measuring out 2 parts A and 1 part B of epoxy, which is the manufacturer's recommendation, and then mixing it with some chopsticks. And you can tell that this is a beginner's setup. I am a beginner, this is my first pour, so please keep that in mind. But what is not excusable is me not wearing protective gloves. And that is a huge mistake, because epoxy is a really bad carcinogen and you shouldn't get it on your skin. In the later pours you will see me wearing gloves all the time. If you are paying really close attention, then you can see that this side of the workpiece has actually been sanded. And I did this because I just wanted to see if I could remove all the burn marks that were left from the router process. Thankfully, I was able to remove it, and this made me a bit less anxious about the upcoming steps. So I'm just using a brush here and making sure to go into each and every crack, each and every surface, and just pour as much epoxy as the wood can take up. And I actually mixed up a bit too little, so I had to go in with a second batch and then fill in everything that was left out in the first go. After letting it dry for about 3 days, this was February, so epoxy dried really, really slowly because it was really cold in my workshop. I had to flip it around and do the same thing on the other side. Flipping it around is really difficult, since it is still about 50 kilograms after the router process, and I really didn't want to break my back. But thankfully no injuries happened, and I actually managed to get a good workout in. Finally, in this shot I'm wearing gloves. Good job. After this priming process I was quite optimistic, but there were still some major challenges to conquer before I could pour any epoxy. Okay, so now that the epoxy has dried, it's time to fill these gaps. And here comes a big issue. Basically, I need to seal all these weird geometries with something to prevent the epoxy from leaking out. And after doing some research, this is my plan. Now, I know I am setting myself up for failure, but I'm going to be using duct tape to cover every single crack on the underside of this table. And hopefully it won't leak, but time will tell. My extensive research was 3 or 4 YouTube videos in which I saw this method applied, and it worked magnificently for them. So why shouldn't it work for me, right? But still, I want to have some more insurance, so I'm going to be doing the whole pour on this huge piece of drywall. I really didn't have anything larger than this that was absolutely flat, and I needed to have an absolutely flat surface because any deviance would cause a small leak, and a small leak turns into a large leak quite fast. So here you can see me taking my time, applying duct tape to every single crack, every single surface that is going to be filled by epoxy. As I was making my way around the whole table, I was getting more and more paranoid because so many things could go wrong. One crack could leak and the whole table could drain, and that would mean a huge loss of money because epoxy is really expensive, as I've said before. So I was thinking about additional safety measures. I've thought about my options carefully, and in the end what I decided on doing was to run a bead of silicone around my duct tape covered holes and then to stick my tape covered drywall piece onto the underside of the table. Hopefully this will provide a boundary for the epoxy and will stop any leaks if they happen. My plan was flawless. I was quite confident and I applied the bead of silicone around all my duct tape pieces and then stuck on my drywall. I carefully lowered it down to the floor of my workshop and then let it set up overnight. I even decided to run a bead of silicone around the entire perimeter of the table, but as you can see, my drywall piece is way too small for this, so this was pretty useless. I just finish up with another bead of silicone around each hole, and then I can finally start to mix up my epoxy. I bought this black pigment that is supposed to be mixed into the hardener of the epoxy and then mixed into the final batch. And hopefully I will mix in just enough so that it will look black, but not too much so that it won't stain the wood. By the way, I had to cut this part down quite a bit and had to speed it up also because it took a really long time to mix epoxy by hand. You are supposed to mix it with drill and a mixing attachment for 10 minutes. So what I had was a wooden spoon and 30 minutes of time, so that's what I did. I just opened my shop doors and mixed away. And after a while, this is what I was left with. A perfectly homogeneous, dark mixture that I could finally pour into the table. This was still in February or early March, I think, and the epoxy cures in about 5 days worth of time, so I have plenty of time to pour it. I took my time, I was precise and wasted as little as possible. In the beginning, everything was going well. It was filling up nicely and all the cracks seemed to pop from the contrast. It looked really cool. On these smaller ones, epoxy really didn't seem to go into every single crack, so my boundary layer was providing a much needed support and hopefully they would seep in when I left the table overnight. By now, you may have noticed it on these two large cracks. The epoxy's level is lowering. And at this point, I've noticed it too. My duct tape seals are not working as well as I had thought. But not everything was lost, because only the adhesion was broken, and I was still optimistic that this pour would be a minor success. But then I noticed this as well. This is epoxy-proof tape, so it is meant to be used on these tables, and it actually leaked under it. I have no idea how this happened, but after letting it dry for 5 days, most of my epoxy was gone. After finding peace with the loss of $100 worth of epoxy, it was time to assess the damage. I took apart all my duct tape seals, and it revealed that there was no epoxy left in most of my cracks. But not all was lost, as this tape actually worked pretty well in most areas. only in a small area did it leak under the table. And I found the culprit. The drywall was bending underneath the weight of the table, so I should have propped it up, something like this. But I didn't, so it's time to break it apart. I was being pretty gentle, but after a while, the table finally gave. And this is the side I was left with. All my epoxy went to the underside of the table, except for one spot right in the middle, where my silicone boundary seemed to work great. So the silicone boundary method works, but I need to apply more and more precisely. That leaves me with only one issue: the cracks on the side of the table. And for that I set up this experiment. This is just a beam that I cut in half to make some jagged edges, and I'm gonna use a hot glue gun to seal up the sides. Then just pour in some epoxy and see if it leaks. Hopefully this method should work. This is basically how a 3D printer works. So I took inspiration from my 3D printer. And after pouring the epoxy and seeing that it didn't leak, leaving it dry overnight and seeing that it still did not leak, I knew I had a working method for all the weird geometries on my table. I also brought home this huge MDF sheet, covered it in tape, and I was ready to try again. I bought some better silicone. This is actually a better sealant, and I'm going to apply 2 layers around the boundary. Also, I'm going to apply a huge layer around the edge of the entire wood piece, and hopefully, really hopefully, this will stop any leaks. Next, it's time to deal with the sides. I'm going to be using the method I showed you before. I applied about 40 layers of hot glue on the sides, and this will result in some overpour on the epoxy, but I can just send that away in the end. I'm also going to torch the entire thing in the end, and hopefully this melts the hot glue and will seal any small holes that form. Next, it was time to pour. Here I did the same thing as before, but any epoxy that was still in the wood I scuffed up with some sandpaper to give some better adhesion. And as you can see, my glue joints are working quite nicely. But eventually I did notice a couple of tiny leaks on the sides, so I took my sealant and poured some silicone into the tiny holes. And this did the trick, and my table was finally starting to take shape. After pouring the final bit of epoxy, I popped all bubbles with this butane torch. Next, it was time to erase my mistakes. So it's back to the router sled again. I did a very shallow pass, and in the beginning it was going really nicely. So it was removing material, it was leaving the wood really nice and soft and kind of polished underneath, but eventually the room started to fill up with smoke, and then more smoke, and then even more smoke. And my table was pretty much burned on the top layer. So I was gonna have to do a lot of sanding to remove this. So my mistake has been corrected and has generated an even bigger mistake. This is going to take serious amounts of time to correct. You can clearly see the line where my router bit gave up. So I should have switched to a new one immediately when I noticed some burn marks. But I guess that is just one more thing that's added to the list of things I learned during this project. By the way, this is the router bit that is in question, so if you have any input on it or how to save it, I really don't want to buy a new one every single project, then please let me know in the comments down below. Anyway, now it's time to fix the mistake. I was really worried that I would spend ages behind my belt sander, but thankfully it removed material pretty fast. So I think that I got the whole table sanded in a matter of 5 hours. that's better than I expected, because I've spent some days sanding before and it's really not fun, and I really wasn't looking forward to it. But this did the job. This wasn't the last time that I was going to use the belt sander in this project, because I really wanted to just remove the burn marks, and I succeeded in that, but I didn't remove the router lines, and I needed to do that in the future. But I was just so bored of sanding that I had to do something else. So I decided on fixing up the sides of the table, and especially taking care of that huge blob of epoxy that is on the overpour near the cracks on the sides of the whole slab because of my hot glue gun method. The method worked well, but it's time for some cleanup. First, I'm going to be using this really aggressive wood rasp. And thankfully, it worked like a charm. I tore through this epoxy blob in like 20 minutes. The same on the other side. But the mistake wasn't completely gone. I had to use my wire wheel again to remove another layer of wood and epoxy from the sides. And I really didn't want to damage the live edge of the table that much, so I took it minimally, took it slowly, and this is what I ended up with. I think it looks pretty decent. Now, from the epoxy pour, there were these small pinholes that were left, so I'm just gonna use some black hot glue and fill them up really nicely. I cover them up with a slab of granite and then go in with a chisel and remove it. Hopefully, in the final sanding process, they will turn invisible. I actually made this black tinted hot glue myself by using the same pigment that was used for the epoxy table and melting some clear hot glue sticks into it, basically sacrificing a frying pan and then just pouring it out onto some parchment paper and then crumpling it up. And this proved to be a really cool solution to provide the same black color that the epoxy was. Obviously, I cannot use this material to fill every single gap because it is soft, but on these tiny pinholes and tiny cracks, it will do just fine. On some of the cracks, I decided on using this wood glue and wood dust mixture. This is really just the wood dust that came out from the sanding process and just wood glue mixed together. It fills up cracks really nicely and evenly, and in the end I can just sand it down and it will look perfectly smooth. After sanding the other side of the table in which I poured the epoxy, I noticed that there was some underpour, so these will need to be filled up. And yeah, I'm really annoyed that I have to do another epoxy pour, but that's life. So I scuff up all the shiny surfaces, cover them with some sealant, and then pour some epoxy into them. It's not the work that annoys me, but it's the waiting time, because each time you pour epoxy, you have to wait about 5 to 7 days for it to dry up. And I really cannot use my workshop when I'm pouring epoxy, because dust would get into it. So that's the annoying part. But after letting it dry for 5 days, I'm finally left with a complete table that is completely filled. I'm going to be using my belt sander again to remove all the overpour that was produced from the process of hiding the underpour. If you are a professional woodworker or just have seen a lot of these builds, then you must have cringed a lot during this, because I'm really just a beginner and I have no idea what I'm doing. But since you are still here, I reckon that you like my content. So if you do enjoy what I do, then I would like to ask you to subscribe, because I have lots more projects coming up and I plan to improve a lot in the future. Hopefully less mistakes and hopefully better content for you to watch. Now that the rough sanding is done, let's move on to finish sanding. I'm going to be using 5 different grits, going all the way up to 180. Between each grit I use a water bottle and spritz on some water to pop the grain. And after an agonizing amount of time, one side is done. Time to flip it over. Yeah, it didn't get any lighter. I just know that someone will be enjoying me struggling with this huge table and hoping that it will crush me. But thankfully, that did not happen. So now it's the same thing on the other side. First, I'm gonna need to do some rough sanding to remove all the router marks. Then I need to go in with 40 grit, then 80 grit, pop the grain, wipe off all the excess water, then go in with 100 grit and 120 grit, pop the grain, wipe off all the excess water, then 180 and finally 240 by hand. And there you go. It's nice, crisp and shiny. For the final clean, I'm going to be using some water and some denatured alcohol. Hopefully this will dissolve all the grease that came off from my fingers and all the dust will be removed from the table. Ready to apply finish. It seems that all professional woodworkers use Rubio to finish these huge slab tables, so I invested in a smaller jug. And yeah, it costs a pretty penny, but I think that it is quite cheap when it comes to finishing wood tables, because you only need such a small amount. Like, I use 40 grams, 30 grams of the actual finish, and then 10 grams of the accelerator on each side. I think that is a pretty economical solution. If I were to use it for the thing that it is intended for, so finishing hardwood floors, then it would be a different story. But for finishing tables and furniture, I think that it's a pretty good product. From what I understand, you need to use a scraper, and I didn't have any scraper around, so I'm just gonna use this, I don't know, car windshield wiper thing, and this really doesn't work, so I opted to use a sponge instead to spread the Rubio onto the surface. From what I've seen online, you need to buff this finish in. So I'm going to be using some normal towels and some paper towels to buff the finish in, and then wipe off all the excess with some soft toilet paper. Yeah, why toilet paper? I don't know. I just had that in the garage, so I used it. After flipping it over one last time, I apply the finish onto the other side as well. This time with a much nicer scraper and a bit more liberal of a pour of Rubio. I've heard that you need to seal both sides with the finish at the same time, because it could warp the table when you finish only one side and leave it to dry overnight. So that's why I did the flip around method. And I also actually invested in 100 pairs of these nitrile gloves, and this proved to be a really good investment, especially in future projects when I'm going to be working with more epoxy. Now, let's take a quick count on how many times I failed during this project. I failed on the router because of the burn marks. I failed on the epoxy pour because of the leaks. I failed with my method of sealing twice. And I failed in the sanding process because I had to use way more time than was necessary. This finishing process was also not that great, so the final finish isn't perfect. But this is my table. I made it, and I'm going to sell it. This is not $1,000 table because I sold it for $1,000. It's because it cost me $1,000. All the tools, all the man hours, all the epoxy has resulted in this. So, what do you think? Was it worth it? Would you pay $1,000 for this? let me know in the comments down below. With that said, let me show you the beauty shots, and I will see you guys next time.